I'm glad you put the introduction that way, because I was kind of reminded, looking at the events program, of the situation in the Jews and Worcester story where Worcester kind of messes up someone's romantic intentions by getting 4 people to sing the same song just before him. And I know that I'm the 3rd speaker to come and address you from Cambridge in as many days. So I'm glad you emphasised that I am actually also very much an LSE person. And I'm here. Every time there's anything here, I can hear everyone coming in and out. And very interested in talking to people whilst I am. I've come to the LSE. I've come back to the LSE for the summer, partly because I had some ill health and it's an easier commute for me, but mostly because I'm working, as Alex said, on some things that I know are of great interest to people here, and there is no better place to be looking at, as you will find out. So, what am I doing? Today, I'm going to be mostly talking about Alex.
If you want to use this guy, you can, so that you don't have to
okay.
get the computer each time.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Today I'm mostly going to be looking at Alex's view, the Aggregate Relevant Claims view. Why am I so interested in this? Well, partly it's because I've been telling Alex what I think he's been doing wrong for a very long time, and I have to say after 2 years at Cambridge I'm kind of missing it. So coming back and doing more of it seemed like the right thing to do. But also, Aggregate Relevant Claims I find offers something which I need in my day job. So I work at the Centre for the Study of Existential Risk, and we do a lot of work talking to a great many people about why they should think more about human extinction. And the classical argument about why you should think more about human extinction is it's just so bad. It's not like ordinarily bad, you know, there are normal bad things, but this is just orders of magnitude worse. Because whilst it's true that everyone in the world dies, it's also true that you lose all these future lives. And that makes it so much worse than anything that will merely affect the present and even the next couple of future generations. Human extinction is something that we need to avoid at all costs. And that's all very well and good, but there are lots of people in this world who are not utilitarians, alas, and who don't accept lots of things that utilitarians take as standard. Such as that we can say that you need to bear some costs now because there are these massive benefits on offer that will fall to other people. Weighing goods, weighing lives, aggregating costs and benefits across different people. Also that we should care about people who don't exist yet, merely possible future lives. And that we should care about uncertain, risky scenarios. So one of these things is certainly this issue of aggregation. And one I find very much whenever I'm talking to economists, certain planners, lots of people in technology and industry, they're really pro-aggregation. They want to say, yeah, you've got these costs and benefits, but you know, so long as the benefits outweigh the costs, or so long as the benefits outweigh the costs enough, just go ahead and do it. That's the important thing. But then, obviously, you've also got a lot of other people you want to talk to, lawyers, regulators, certain healthcare professionals, who really don't like aggregation. You really want to say, no, look, this bad thing is something you've just got to avoid. It doesn't matter what you have to give up to avoid this bad thing, you must avoid doing that. Or this good can't be weighed against any other cost. You know, it's too valuable, too important that we keep that. And this is tricky, because these point in very different moral directions. And I think the first thing that I did when I started coming up with this problem was to just argue the toss with people. Hey, I'm broadly utilitarian, I'm quite Poffidian, but you know, I like aggregation. Aggregation is what I'm good at. So if you don't like aggregation, you're wrong, and I need to tell you why you're wrong, and then people stop returning my phone calls, and so I stopped doing that. The second thing that you do, which is relatively straightforward and easy, is you just go around agreeing with everyone. Okay, that's your worldview. Never mind, you should still care about existential risk for this reason, or that reason, or the other reason. Find whatever it is that I needed to engage with this particular person before me, even if that wasn't my favourite philosophical theory. But the issue with that is, well, without a coherent moral theory that's guiding the kind of recommendations you make, there is a real risk that you will end up making contradictory or irrational recommendations or suggestions to different people, because you need a single framework that you can use to evaluate the different points of view and the different arguments that you're making. So what I needed was a theory that would allow me to both incorporate pro-aggregationist and anti-aggregationist points of view, and to mediate between them, preferably in some sort of quantifiable way, so that I can actually measure the relative effects of the two considerations. And then I realized that this was something that Alex had been working on, and I read about it, and I had a go at him about when I was a master's student as well. And it's potentially a very useful approach. The issue is that Alex has developed this view with quite a narrow range of cases in mind. And unfortunately, the things that he's chosen to exclude from his narrow range of cases are risk and uncertainty and future generations, which are exactly my bread and butter. So I'm not able to just use aggregate relevant claims in its current form. So I've come here to the LSE to try and develop a new and improved, I hope, aggregate relevant claims view that can take account of all of these things. And what I'm going to be presenting to you now is the first part of this expanded view, which I'm developing. And this one deals with interpersonal risk, social risk. So how we trade off imposing a risk upon one person, or indeed giving them a benefit where we don't know whether that benefit is going to materialize or not, but where we know the probabilities of that risk against a risk, or indeed a certainty of cost and benefit to someone else. In further papers that I won't be touching on today, but I'd be very happy to talk with people, I look at how we might apply this view and the competing claims view it builds on to cases where we don't know the probabilities of the risks, in ambiguous cases, and finally how we might apply these in interesting ways to population effect cases, cases where you have different numbers or different identities of the people involved. So here is the aggregate relevant claims view in its current form. So it first sets out what a claim is and when people have claims and their interests are at stake. It then sets out when these claims compete. That's axiom 2. Axiom 3 gives you how you determine the strength of claims based upon the size of the welfare benefit that people might receive and upon the well-being level of the individuals who would receive it. The fourth axiom talks about when claims are relevant for the purpose of comparison, which in this view depends entirely and only upon the strength of those claims. And then the fifth axiom tells you what to do. When claims compete, you should maximize the strength of the claims that you can satisfy. In this paper, I'm going to talk about axiom 3 and axiom 4. In the paper on uncertainty, I talk more about axiom 2. In the paper on population effects, I talk mainly about axiom 1, or I also return to axiom 4 again. Axiom 5, I have no problems with that. That's a beautiful axiom. Well done, Alex. Sorry, where am I? Yep. Before I go on and look at how this view can deal with risks, I just want to put on this brief aside that the view tells you how the strength of claims, so it tells you the direction of the relationship between the strength of claims and these two features that it mentions, the size of the benefit and the well-being level of the person involved. It doesn't tell you anything else about the nature of that benefit. It doesn't tell you, sorry, the nature of that relationship. It doesn't tell you whether these two relationships are of equal size, whether one is greater than the other. It also doesn't tell you, which is what I'm talking about here, whether they're linear relationships in which you double the size of the benefit, you double the strength of the claim, or whether you provide some sort of weighting such that if you have double the benefit, you get more than double the strength of claims. And I talk about this, about giving priority to the claims of people who would receive the larger benefits or who would be even worse off. And I describe this broadly at several points in prioritarian terms. It's worth noting that the view is already somewhat prioritarian because it gives more concern to benefits that accrue to those who are worse off. Adding this additional priority weighting gives it a double dose of prioritarianism, but also, and in many ways this is more interest to me, it also allows you to incorporate this view called the dispersed additional burdens principle that Larry Temkin has, which is also closely related to Derek Parfit's dual wide person affecting view. And that's the idea that a large benefit to a single individual is worth more than a lot of small benefits to many other people, even if you add up all those small benefits and you get even more goodness in total. There's something very important about big benefits and big costs compared to lots and lots of little costs and benefits. Quite apart from these considerations of whether they're relevant, we also just prefer, or have moral reason to prefer, satisfying claims that involve big benefits, and also, you might say, that accrue to people who are worse off. So I will, at several points, appeal to this idea that we might have these priority weightings in order to justify, well, in order to incorporate that kind of principle into disperse additional burdens. So the structure of the talk, then, is going to fall broadly into 3 sections. In the first section, I'm going to look at the simplest ways in which we might use aggregate relevant claims to look at cases involving social risk. That is, either with no modification or with only a very slight modification to axiom 3 of the view. In the second section, having argued that that is not the way to go, I will argue for more substantial changes. Firstly, with a change to axiom 3 and axiom 4, and then finally, the view that I in fact propose at the end of the talk, with quite a radical change to axiom 4, quite a radical change to the way that we think about the relevance of claims, at least within this aggregate relevant claims view. Then, in the final section, I'm going to, assuming that we have time and we get back to that, I'm going to look at whether some of the changes that I propose might also make sense even in cases in which there aren't risks, the sort of cases that the view was originally intended to handle, that involve mainly inequality, and I shall end with some reflections upon what my view implies about practical reason. So I'm going to have questions in between each of these sections as well as at the end, so any questions?
Just to clarify, so I guess this is sort of half-directed at Alex. Is the point of this restricting things to claims that are sufficiently important to sort of rule out, I don't know, swamping the important claims by lots and lots and lots of trivial ones?
Yes, exactly.
Right, so you don't want someone to be sort of shocked in order to relieve the board of the millions.
Yes.
That's what this is doing.
Although, one restriction I have is it's about the distribution of benefits, not about weighing harms against benefits, because one might have further reasons for, you know, the harming versus not aiding distinction.
Thank you, and I did mean to say that as well. I'm not observing that restriction in this talk, not because I don't think it's a good restriction, and there are plenty of people who would argue that, but simply because I start out from a consequentialist perspective in which you don't draw that distinction. So I will, in this talk, be mixing up distributions of benefits and distributions of harms, because I take this view that those are kind of just 2 ways of looking at the same thing. But of course, if you did observe that restriction, that would be fine, and I don't think anything I'm about to say rests on my not observing that restriction. But
I have one question for you, which is about how do you plan to deal with whether future people have claims to be brought into existence, given that you're dealing with existential risk?
So, one line, they do have claims, but those claims are not relevant when they compete against the claims that people who already exist have to be better off, unless those claims are of a special kind. That is, either unless the people would live a bad life, or unless the people would live an incredibly good life, in which case they might be relevant. Okay. But that's how I plan to deal with it. I'm not going to say any more about that here.
Okay.
That is the punchline of paper 3 I've just given you there.
Okay.
So you can have what Parfit says in his recent paper, where you do have existential claims, and we have a reason to bring people into existence, but you just, those aren't relevant.
Okay.
And there are various rules of how you get that. Okay? So, I fear I may have timed myself in knots a bit linguistically here. This paper is very much in development, so there's definitely lots of bugs in it. And I switch between 2 things, describing 2 things that possibly are not the same, although, as I say, from my perspective, I'm seeing harms and benefits as very much 2 ways of looking at the same thing, so they work out the same. One of those is discussions about risk, and the other of those is about giving people a probability of receiving a benefit, an expected benefit with a less than, with a probability of less than 1 of occurring. And I'm going to use the same terminology to describe those two things. I am perfectly comfortable with doing that. It's not raising any alarm bells with me, but I'm aware that probably for some in this room that feels like a terribly illegitimate thing to do. If it's possible that if you're one of those people and it's possible for you to twist my words around a bit to make it something that sounds more legitimate, I'd be grateful for you to do that. And if you could send me an email afterwards telling me how I should reword this, I would be most grateful, as I am not. I have many abilities, but choosing the right words to describe things is often not one of them, which does draw into question my suitability as a philosopher, but never mind, I've got this far. So, having said that, I'm dealing with benefits where these aren't certain benefits, these are benefits with a probability, and I'm conceiving most of these benefits in terms of mitigating a risk that someone might have otherwise suffered a harm. Now, Alex's presentation of the RC, because it's not designed to deal with risk, makes no mentions at all of probability or risk. But let's just try to begin with to just apply it to cases involving probability and risk. So we care about two things. We care about the size of the benefit, and we care about the welfare level of the person involved. And let's assume that the size of that benefit is only the size of, the ex post size of the benefit. You're not taking into account how likely the benefit is when you describe that. Well, if we were to do that, which I don't suspect that anyone would do, but still you get these odd results where if you're choosing between giving Anne a certain benefit, a benefit with a probability of 1, or giving both Bob and Charles the same size benefit, but there's only a 1 in 100 chance that they'll actually receive it, so you're acting in a way that they will have this expectation, there's a 1 in 100 chance that they'll get that benefit. Well, Bob and Charles's claims will be stronger because they're the same size, because the size of the welfare benefit will be equal. So we should give both of them their 1 in 100 chance. But obviously we shouldn't, because most likely that's going to mean no one gets any benefits. So we definitely need to do something to take account of how likely or unlikely we are to actually benefit a person, as well as the potential size of that benefit when determining the size of claims. Okay, so let's do that the simple way. In this, you say, well, in effect, if a benefit is more likely, the person has a stronger claim to that benefit. If it's less likely, they have a weaker claim to that benefit. But we're going to leave every other part of the RSA view the same. Is this okay? I think not. The problem here is now we still have Anne, who will definitely receive this particular benefit of size X. But now we have a million other people, each of whom would have a 1 in 100 chance of receiving the same benefit. Now we're saying these million people, their claims to receive this benefit are much, much smaller. We don't know exactly how much smaller because we haven't specified the exact nature of the relationship, but let's say they're 100 times smaller. A difference of 100-fold between strengths of claims would typically, on an ARC type view, be seen as sufficient to make the lesser claim trivial and irrelevant when compared to the greater claim. All these people have such a small expected benefit, they have and therefore have such a small claim, that we just shouldn't care about these millions of tiny claims. The problem is, because this is a situation involving risk, what we can actually expect to happen is we'll get 10,000 times the benefit if we give these million people all a 1 in 100 chance of receiving X, rather than just N. So the problem here is that because the aggregate relevant claims view moves straight from the strength of a claim to the relevance of a claim, if we're discounting the strength of claims according to the probability that the benefit will be received, we're doing exactly the same thing to relevance. And so we say that these claims are irrelevant, even though in the end you're going to get much more benefit. I think this is the wrong kind of conclusion, so I reject this approach as well. Someone else who seems to reject this kind of reasoning is Otsuka. who has a slightly different argument, but in which he makes basically the same point. So in Mike's paper, he's considering whether we should save a limb, an arm, of one identified Floridian. There's this person in Florida, definitely he's going to lose his arm. Or whether we should expose everyone in California, or 40 million of them, to a risk of death. And he cashed it out slightly differently in the part of the paper I'm quoting here, but a risk of death such that we know that only one person is going to die. And he makes the same point, that in this situation, if we were to discount the strength of these Californians' claims according to that very low probability that each of them will be the one who dies, then we're going to come up with this view that these claims are trivial and we don't need to care about them. But actually, at the end of the day, someone is going to die, and that matters. This I agree with. Mike then goes on to put forward his own story about what we should do instead. So on Mike's view, what matters here is that at the end of the day, someone is going to die. And what we should do, rather than being concerned with all these tiny ex-ante claims, is we should care about the one big ex-post claim of the person who died, that they had for us to act so that they wouldn't have died. I don't agree with this way of thinking about the problem. I think that Mike is quite right that we need to avoid discounting the relevance of these people's claims, but I still think that the ex-ante approach to aggregating claims is the right one, even under conditions of risk such as this. So I have two objections to Mike's view. The first is, I don't agree with him about what we should actually do in this case. So for Mike, it is clear that we should save the unidentified life in California. We should remove not expose all these Californians to this additional risk. But instead, what we definitely should do is sacrifice the limb of the person in Florida. Now, here this is kind of flaky ground. I don't agree with that. To me, it seems that actually the risks that these people in California face are smaller than this one poor Floridian who's going to lose his arm, and that does matter. That merely exposing somebody to a risk of harm is less morally significant than definitely harming any individual. And so, as I was mentioning previously, I would take a somewhat prioritarian approach to this, or a disperse additional burdens approach to this, and say that even if in aggregate all of these claims that the Californians have not to be exposed to this risk are greater than the claim of the single Floridian, nevertheless they each count for less. Now I can't be certain how that's going to cash out in numerical terms in this particular case, but what I do know is that on Mike's view we have no alternative but to take the view that we should treat giving 40 million people a 1 in 40 million risk of death exactly the same as we would treat killing one person for certain. I accept that there's some slight difference in that Mike is talking about a slightly different kind of risk, in that he's talking about having it so that definitely one person will die in California. I've used that mostly just because these are the most quotable sections of Mike's paper, and for the moment I wanted to quote rather than extemporize on what I think he's saying, but at the end of this paper he draws basically exactly the same conclusions, albeit in a somewhat different manner, for cases involving the sort of risk that I'm talking about. The second objection, and the one where I feel I'm on firmer ground with Mike, is that, as Mike in fact notes, people do accept tiny risks of death for small inconveniences for small conveniences, for small improvements in their lives on a very regular basis. This is the sort of trade-off that we make in our own lives. And I would note that we don't just make this for ourselves. We don't just say, I'm going to cross the road here rather than going to the traffic light, because even though my risk of being knocked down by a car is slightly higher, I want to get my lunch quickly, and the sandwich shop is just over there. We also actually make these kind of trade-offs for people we love, care about, and have a moral responsibility towards. So, for instance, parents may allow their children to undergo surgery to correct even quite minor impairments, or even to correct purely cosmetic impairments, even though all surgery that involves anaesthetic or other invasive procedures will carry some minuscule risk of death. Nevertheless, we judge that it's worth it. I think if we were to take this ex post approach to working out the strength of claims in situations under risk, we would be forced to the view that whether or not individuals should be able to make these kind of trade-offs for themselves, we shouldn't be allowed to do them on other people, and that also if the government could prevent people from crossing the road at a dangerous place or whatever, that they should do that. Because some people do die crossing the road to get a quicker sandwich. Some children do die having operations to prepare a cleft lip and so on and so forth. And what we should do is we should evaluate those great costs of the people who actually die against all of these trivial benefits, and we should dismiss all the trivial benefits. But actually, I think that's the wrong thing to do. I think that just everyday moral practice suggests that no, even if we know that some people really do die doing these things, if the risk to us or those we care about is so small, then we should be allowed to make just this kind of ex-ante trade-off. And I will come back to this point later when it crops up as an objection to another theory I'm going to propose. However, before I do that, any more questions? Mike?
I suppose I should ask a question. So first...
How did you misinterpret me so badly?
As far as the second objection is concerned, I'm not sure whether I succeed, to set aside cases where you can be offered an ex-ante justification for being exposed to risks. So the particular cases I describe are cases in which, at least, on a simple interpretation of the cases, there isn't such a justification. Okay? I agree that we should be able sometimes to justify exposing people to risks on grounds of the benefit to them, and it's really tricky how we do that, but I just try to set those cases to one side. Okay, now, as far as your first objection, so there's the case of Bob, who's certain to lose a limb, we know who he is, or 40 million Californians, each of whom has a 1 in 40 million chance of losing a life. Okay, so like 3 different versions. The version that you're more focused on is where the risk to each Californian is independent. So it's as if there's a gun, each Californian is played Russian roulette on with a different gun that has 40 million chambers, 1 bullet. Okay, that's the case you're interested in. The cases I've focused on are cases where, as you noted, exactly 1 Californian will die at the end of the day. Okay, and one of them is where there's a single roulette wheel over every Californian, 40 million slots. The roulette ball will eventually go down a slot over a particular Californian's head. Okay. And then the other one is where there's a particular Californian who has this allergic reaction, and he'll die if you do the thing which affects Californians. For sure, he's fated. We just don't know who that Californian is. So it's a mere epistemic risk.
Yeah.
I think at least in that case, the mere fact that we actually know who the Floridian is, I mean, suppose that we didn't know who the Floridian, I mean, the mere fact that it's just our ignorance that constitutes a 1 in 40 million risk can't justify our saying, okay, let's expose the Californians to the risk as opposed to the Floridian. I think I still want to insist on that.
Yeah, and I'm being somewhat unfair to your view. However, I do want to take your first point, which is what I was quoting you on, and you do carry on that first point. You argue at the end of the paper that you do think it's the same principle for when we deal with this last kind of risk, with every Californian playing Russian roulette with a really massive gun, with lots of chambers in it, based on the idea that there will still be this fictional person, the person who is going to die. And then that fictional person is realized when someone dies. But I understood you to be claiming that the argument did go through in those cases as well. You were just mostly discussing other kinds of cases. Did I?
Yeah, that's right. Actually, the fictional person crops up differently.
Oh, have I got that wrong as well?
It's where, I say, suppose that you do say Bob's limb. Then you ask, well, what if I had done otherwise and spun the indeterministic roulette wheel? Well, there's no fact of the matter who would die.
Yeah.
And that gives rise to the question, was it just a fictional person? In which case, bizarrely, there's no complaint if you actually, I mean, if there's no open counterfactual, then it's hard to determine whether it's, but then as far as moving from these cases where for certain one California will or would die, to cases where all the risks are independent, so only on average one will die, could be 0, could be 40 million. And in fact, there's something like a 37% chance that no Californian will die. But I guess E or 1 over E or something like that. And then what I say is, given on average that one will die, as long as you think that the significance of 0 versus 1, 1 versus 2, 2 versus 3 dying is always the same, then on average 1 dying should be the same as 1 dying for certain. That's the argument I use, and I agree that it's, actually that's probably the weakest argument, that's weaker than the other arguments I've been mentioning, and so that it gives you grounds to say, well, at least when the risks are independent, you shouldn't take my approach.
Okay. Thank you for clarifying that. Perhaps I could talk more with you about the specific part of the paper, and make sure that I quote you more accurately. Okay.
Good. I think. Take us onwards.
So just even whether or not we accept this argument about Mike, I've included this primarily because I think this argument here is in many ways supporting the same kind of conclusion that I was saying before, that if you discount relevance in the same way as strength, then you get these problems where you seem to disregard a lot of claims because they're weak, even though actually they do appear relevant because they add up to such a, to something much greater overall. And then arguing why I don't think that taking this ex post approach to accounting for that kind of what they add up to is the way forward. I want to incorporate that within an ex ante claim. If actually Mike was doing something more like that, then I'm very interested in discussing that further. So, it seems that we have a problem here. If we don't discount the value of claims based on the probability that people will benefit, we get bad results in relation to the strength of claims. But if we do discount them, then we get bad results in relation to the relevance of claims. The solution that seems to me obvious to this sort of dilemma is to try and separate out strength and relevance as two separate factors, and not to say, as the Aggregate Relevant Claims view does, that a claim is more relevant simply insofar as it is stronger. Rather, we might say, as I proposed here, that the strength of a claim does depend upon the probability that a person will benefit, but its relevance doesn't. So, for instance, a 1 in a 100 risk of death is as relevant as a certainty of death, but is much less strong in terms of the claim providing than a certainty of death. But 100 deaths, or if you take my priority weighted view, maybe you say 200 deaths, or so on, would nevertheless compete with and potentially outcompete this certainty of death. And that allows you to escape the problems that I've illustrated thus far. So because we do discount strength, we definitely wouldn't say that you should prefer giving a 1 in 100 risk of benefiting, 1 in 100 probability of benefiting to Bob and Charles compared to a certainty of benefiting to Anne. But because you're not discounting the relevance, it would say that you should nevertheless still help 1 million people by giving them 100 risk, or give a 100 probability of receiving X, rather than just helping one person by giving them a certainty of X. And on Mike's case, or at least my understanding of Mike's case, it could agree with this view that we should definitely save a limb over a life, or it could not. It would depend upon exactly what the relationship is between the probability that someone will benefit and what effect that has on the strength of that person's claim. But at least that's open, even though I would personally take the view that it maybe should be closed. But it's got that option open. The problem with this view comes from the fact that having separated out relevance and strength, we can now get cases in which you get the somewhat bizarre conclusion that a claim may not be relevant when competing against another claim, even though it is in fact stronger than that other claim. So, the example that I'm considering here, this is toes and death, right, isn't it? There's another example where it's toes and legs. I will look it up myself, because that probably is completely... I just don't want to say one thing when it's...
It's toes and
yeah, toes and death, good. Right. So you start off with this view that losing a toe is not relevant when compared with death. So no matter how many toes we could save, if one person is going to die, we should actually satisfy that claim to save the person's life rather than all of these toes. This, I think, is broadly consistent with the kind of view that Alex holds. Now what we're going to do is we're going to say, oh, but you're not saving a person from death, you're saving a person from a very low risk of death, 1 in 100 risk of death, or even smaller, even a 1 in a million risk of death. Now, on the view that I've just sketched here, what this is going to do is it's going to greatly reduce the strength of that claim, but not affect its relevance. I think, I don't know where exactly you're going to, you're going to situate the strength of losing a toe, but I think it is pretty obvious that merely a 1 in a million risk of death, or preventing 1 in a million risk of death, preventing 1 micromort, as it's described in healthcare, is not worth a toe in terms of strength. But because it's saving somebody from a risk of death, it still has the same relevance as any other saving from death type claim, and is therefore saving a person's toe is not relevant when compared to saving a person's life. This, I think, is the same sort of problem as that which I was describing when talking about my interpretation of what Mike had said about the trivial costs and benefits. That clearly here, we should accept this trivial risk of death in order to receive the benefits, because it's stronger, it's a bigger benefit to the individuals concerned, but on the view I've just sketched, we would have to say no. So somebody turns up to hospital, they've crushed their toe, they can save it or they can amputate it. We said, no, we're not going to save it. Said, well, why? Is it physiologically impossible? No, we can do it. Oh, is it expensive? No, it's perfectly cheap, but you'd have to go to this other hospital, the other side of the country. You'd have to go to Manchester, and you've crushed your toe, so you can't drive. So someone else is going to have to drive you. And then that person will have a risk of dying on the road because they're driving you. And we can't expose them to that risk in order to save your toe. We can't do the operation in this hospital, so you've just got to lose the toe. It really doesn't make sense. How then can we avoid this problem? Well, the way to avoid it is to say risk needs to be separated from strength, but in such a way that the strength of a claim will never fall outside of its relevance. Will never fall outside of the range of its relevance. With another way, that no matter what the strength of a claim is, no matter how that is affected by how probable or improbable the associated benefit is, it will always be the case that claims of a similar strength to what this claim actually is will be relevant to that claim. So this is my proposal for how we get that result. We give up on the view inherent in the aggregate relevant claims view that relevance is a single value, a single point value for any given claim. And then what we're doing when we're seeing which claims are relevant to that claim is we're just looking at the relative strength or the relative relevance of two claims. Are they sufficiently close in strength? Or now, because we separate the strength and relevance, are they sufficiently close in terms of relevance for one claim to be relevant to the other? Instead, what we should say is, look, here's the strength of a claim, and then the relevance of that claim is the range of strengths of other claims with which this claim can compete. So it has a lower bound, which is the weakest claim that may compete against this claim, so enough of those claims would be worth satisfying more than satisfying this one single claim. And an upper bound, which represents the strongest claim with which this claim can compete. So enough of this claim would be definitely better than, enough of this claim should be satisfied in preference to this other higher claim. And then you allow the top and bottom, the upper and lower bounds of this relevance range to move independently. This is roughly how I propose this working. So what you do is you say, well, look, here we have strength. And a claim to be saved from a certainty of death might be up here. And all things being equal, it might be relevant with claims, well, I mean, it's hard to imagine claims that are stronger than death, but sort of being saved from life and torture or something might be relevant with claims all the way up to there, and claims down to here might be relevant with it. Now we imagine that we're no longer dealing with a claim for a certainty of death. Instead, we're dealing with a claim to be saved from a 1 in 100 risk. Well, what that does is it greatly reduces the strength of the claim. It's now down here. The upper bound of the relevance range, however, doesn't move. That is the same as it was before, as it would be for saving someone from a certainty of death. The lower bound moves down with the strength. So now, this claim, enough saving people from a 1 in 100 risk of death, will still be relevant when compared with saving one person from death. It'll be a lot weaker, but the claims can still compete. They're still relevant to one another. But if we have here, this is saving someone's toe. It's slightly stronger claim to saving someone from 1 in 100 risk of death, and it has, but this is a certainty of saving someone's toe, so it has quite a narrow relevance range. So this claim to be saved from a 1 in 100 risk of death will be relevant both when compared with saving someone from a certainty of death and with saving somebody from losing a toe, even though saving somebody from losing a toe and saving somebody from a certainty of death are not relevant when compared with each other. They would not compete. You would always save the life, no matter how many toes you could save instead. This obviously allows us to avoid the aforementioned problem, because it's now no longer the case that if one claim is weaker than another, the first claim cannot be relevant, because the lower bound for the claims that will be relevant when competing against this claim will always move down with strength, and the strength of the claim will always sit within the relevancy range. I think this is the best way I can think of for resolving the 4 problems that I've described so far. However, as I mentioned at the beginning, this talk is still very much in development, and there may be other kinds of claim that it cannot satisfy. There may be other kinds of case that this view cannot resolve. I would love to hear about them, because I'm very interested in further developing it. And on that note, does anyone have any more questions?
Shall I help by pointing out by calling on the individuals?
Yes, please.
Yes. Jason.
So, Simon, this isn't so much a question about the particular way that you just addressed, but I'm trying to think about some of the way the trade-offs of strength and relevance and so on go. Are you thinking about relevance from some sort of objective point of view, or is relevance supposed to take into account the subjective considerations of individuals? Because you began the talk saying you wanted to take a utilitarian consequentialist point of view, but many of the kind of arguments that you've been given have been talking about relevance as if it is just sort of a fact written into the fabric of the universe.
Sure. That is a very good question.
Let me just kind of say why I'm asking this, because thinking about the toe and the life trade-off and about relevance. So yeah, for me, because I'm not talented in sports, I don't really use my toes for anything except not falling over, I can see the trade-off making sense. But if I'm thinking about, say, the primary ballerina, then losing the toe might almost be equivalent to losing a life because of all of the investment and training and skill that goes with. And so so this is why I'm kind of asking: is it subjective or objective?
Sure. I mean, from what you've just said, I absolutely don't need to say it's subjective to say what you just said is right about the ballerina, because obviously losing a toe it's different for a ballerina than for somebody who is, who hardly ever uses their toes. Those things just aren't the same. And when we simplify cases in this kind of example and talk about losing toes or losing limbs, obviously it matters hugely actually what context this is in. So for instance, if you were quadriplegic, it might not matter to you if you lost a toe nearly so much because you couldn't use it. You were stuck in a wheelchair your whole life. That would be irrelevant. But that can be relevant on purely objective grounds. You don't need to take any subjective judgment about value in order to incorporate that kind of extra consideration. I am definitely a moral objectivist. And I think that probably is in tension with what I said at the beginning about how I want to work with all sorts of different moral viewpoints and find theories that can mediate between them. My best defense of that view is that I am a very committed Parfitian, and I definitely take the view that moral objectivism is likely to lead you to something of a compromise between different theories. Because I think that people are reason detectors, and when we engage in moral reasoning, we are responding to something. So yes, people come up with very divergent, different opinions that don't agree about all sorts of things, even very foundational things. But we should develop towards views that are more similar rather than more divergent over time, because there should be some truth in the matter. Whether what you would diverge to is this or not, that's not so important to me. What is important to me at the moment is there are a variety of moral considerations that get raised with me, and I would like to have a theory that could engage productively with them, that could say, yes, that's an important consideration, and this is where it fits into my moral theory, so I can speak your language and we can have an interesting conversation, and I might be able to shift your opinion on something like existential risk. That's where I'm coming from, but fundamentally I think I'm an objectivist, albeit one who tries very hard to be accommodating and non-dogmatic.
Anna, and then you mentioned
did you say earlier in the talk that it was worse to kill one person, let one person die, a specific person die, than to expose, say, 10 people to a 1 in 10 chance of death?
Yes.
So I'm thinking on your picture, so the 1 in 10 chance of death is going to be relevant all the way from the top down.
Yep.
So won't they come out as equal in strength, and they'll be equally strong? I mean, so make it 11 people's risk of death will come out worse than killing one person.
So not necessarily, because what you would do, yes, there's one over here. So this is what I'm saying about we know the direction of the relationship, we don't know the size. So this here is size of benefit, and that's been expected. I hope that everyone understands that shorthand for this includes probability. And here we have strength of claim. I really don't know why I even bother writing. So, but you can have a linear model, right? So in this case, here's death, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So here's a 1 in 10 risk of death, and here are the strength of the two claims. And if you add up 10 of those, you'll get one of those. Yeah. But what I'm suggesting, my preferred view would actually be something like this. So then here, the strength of claim of death is a lot more than 10 times higher than the strength of claim of, from a 1 in 10 risk of death.
Oh, okay.
And you can do that sort of thing completely independently from relevance, because we've separated the two claims out. We've just done so in a way such that a claim will always be relevant with claims of a similar strength, even if it might also be relevant with claims that are much stronger, if it's a claim involving a very low probability but of a very significant effect.
So the badness of concentrated risks, right?
Yeah.
What you're appealing to.
But yeah, so the badness of concentrated risk gets put in on the strength of the claims. Relevance, I mean, relevance is an interesting concept because it doesn't actually bear on how risks compete with one another. All it bears on is which of the risks that, get a seat at the table, or so, I shouldn't say risk, which of the claims that get a seat at the table. So you can be Iceland with a seat at the table, and no one's going to listen to you. But if there were enough Icelands, they'd all get a vote. But if you haven't got a seat at the table, then you don't even get a say. You might be Taiwan. You might be quite a big thing, but you're not there because you're not recognised. So.
Yes, Nicholas.
Yeah, thanks for the talk.
It's not over.
Sorry, I thought we were at the end.
He says, I've still got more to say if you want less than there's time.
Okay, good. So I'll try to display the questions. Yes, go ahead.
There is if, because it looks like
So that's true, if we've got time. If we run out of time,
anyway, but so it seems to me as if they're going to be intransitivities on your view, right?
Yeah.
So,
Next.
yeah, so how do you, are you satisfied with that? How do you deal with that?
There are intransitivities in the view. If you start to take into account this kind of person-effective considerations, there will be intransitivities in your view. That sucks, but at the moment that's not the thing that I'm most worried about. So yeah, I mean, I also do take this view that Alex has promoted and other people have said that you can rescue these views from transitivity if you say that an outcome is not just one outcome, it's one outcome given the choice set that that outcome sits in. Then you can produce transitive choice sets. But then you have, obviously, you're actually dealing with a much greater diversity of outcomes than you thought. That's the way I would go if this became an issue. But at the moment, I'm not worried about it. Just because it's in the nature of the kind of theory that I'm dealing with here. And I want to make this theory better rather than just object to it.
Christian.
Yeah, actually my point was very similar to Niklas's point. So, one feature of your approach here is that you are assessing claims not just in terms of intrinsic properties that these claims have, irrespective of the menu of other claims that you're comparing them with, but you are assessing claims in terms of relational properties that they have in relation to other claims that are also under consideration. Temkin speaks of these, I think, essentially comparative or inherently comparative properties. And it seems that the very moment you look at claims through the lens of such inherently comparative or relational properties, you structurally open the door to these intransitivities. So that seems to be an almost inevitable consequence of this kind of use of relational properties here. So it's just an observation. I don't know what your take is on this.
No, absolutely. And I think the thing is that this happens, as you say, at the very moment that you start to look at these kind of properties, you will be able to construct intransitive preference orderings. And so you've got a choice. You can dismiss all of these moral considerations, or you can learn to live with intransitive preference orderings, which can include doing things like what I was just saying, where you more finely specify the outcomes that you're dealing with, as each outcome is defined in part by its choice sets. Once I referred to these as the affects in an outcome because they were how people were affected, and this made Hillary Greaves incredibly angry. But you can do that. You can say, look, an outcome does include its counterfactuals. That's just a fact about outcomes. And so when I'm evaluating, one outcome, knowing that another outcome is possible, that's not actually essentially comparative. It's just this outcome includes the other counterfactual possible outcomes. I can live with this.
Yeah, just a very quick remark on this then. So if this is the structure of your theory, it would seem to make the theory, in a sense, non-consequentialist. Is that fair enough? I mean, are you happy to embrace that?
No, I do dispute that. I think you can take account of, you can take account of values that depend upon counterfactuals and still be a consequentialist. But I mean, to be honest, it is a blurring of the lines. That I have no question. You would like to be able to draw a really sharp division between contractualism and consequentialism, and this is one of the points where you could put that border. I don't want to draw that distinction because I actively want to mediate between the two, but I don't think that having incorporated this into my view, I've given up on consequentialism. Possibly, especially for reasons that I will get to at the end of the talk. But just basically, when you have a big range like this, you can aggregate much more. Like, claims will play a much less significant role in, and counterfactuals will play a much less significant role in your moral decision making. So sometimes this is going to be very unimportant because actually the relevance range is huge, and then the counterfactuals are quite unimportant. Other times the relevance ranges might be small, and then the counterfactuals become vital. You've got to know what else is on the table before you can decide which claims you can and cannot aggregate. So from sort of quite a practical perspective, sometimes we can be very consequentialist in what we will allow and disallow. Functionally very consequentialist. We don't have to worry about these intransitivities. But they are always going to be there in the theory, and I accept that. I'm not going to try and hide that.
Given that we have another part of the talk, can I ask for some just brief comments and brief responses to allow you to make...
Sure, sorry, I will try and be brief.
No, that's fine, that's quite fine. Richard, first.
Yeah, so on your theory, the risk of death remains relevant no matter how small the risk, right? So what can end up is that even those risks that are so tiny that I'd be willing to take them to alleviate an itch, will remain relevant in your aggregation. So something can be swamped by these, and if enough people. But on the other hand, you still want to. I don't know whether you still want these itches to not be relevant. I mean, that was Alex. Alex didn't want itches to be swamped. I find that sort of implausible that that these risks that are so small that you'd be willing to take them to alleviate your itches are allowed to swamp. Someone who's about to be claimed to not be tortured, but my itches are not.
So the reason for this is just when you add up a lot of itches, you just end up with a lot of itches, right? What you end up with at the end of the day is a lot of trivialities. Now, of course, there are situations in which you don't, and it's very easy to smuggle these in. So if you imagine a 10-second itch, but now I've got so many 10-second itches, I'm going to itch for the rest of my life. No, kill me now, right? Itching for the rest of my life is completely different to itching for the next 10 seconds. But if these itches genuinely are distributed, it doesn't matter how many of you have. Their nature stays the same. Whereas if you add up all these risks of deaths, what you get at the end of the day is a death. And that's a death, and it's as bad as it ever was.
Or you may or may not.
Well, okay, but I mean, if you add up enough, you're eventually going to get there.
As many as you like.
Yeah. I mean,
one expected death.
All right, one expected death, but that's quite different. So in a sense, I do accept a micromort, a 1 in a million chance of dying, because I really don't expect to die. That is actually a very important factor about accepting a micromort, is that I'm almost certainly not going to die. Whereas if I accept an itch, I will itch. So these features of scale just matter a lot more. And when you get to these kind of counterintuitive cases where people use risks as an argument against this kind of swamping, why you should allow small claims to swamp big claims. Oh, because the claim could be really small because it's, involves risk, and then if you add all the risks up, you can get many times the worst outcome, expectedly anyway. You know, as I said at the beginning, like a million times worse expected outcome is what you could have had for certain. So you really should have avoided that. But what we should do, rather than judging aggregate relevant claims based on its, aggregate relevant claims as a theory that responds to itches by applying it to micromorts, we should actually deal with micromorts differently.
Paul, and then Bastian, and then
so my comment was just about the sort of non-linear weighting of the weights that you're giving to, depending on the kind of expected value of these probabilities going up. And I'm just wondering, so the bottom bit is quite plausible and intuitive. So you've got a shallow start, and the top bit is quite plausible because you've got a sort of, you're getting close to certainty, and so you want to give that a lot higher weight. It's the bit in the middle that I worry about. And I sort of wonder if you've got any thoughts about that. One possibility that comes to my mind is that actually in healthcare rationing, there seems to be a rather sort of binary approach. It's either all or nothing. So your probability of recovery is sufficiently low that you're not regarded as having a relevant claim at all. Or your probability goes beyond a certain threshold, and then all of a sudden people say, well, we've got to give this person a chance.
Yeah. So one thing I want to make very clear about this curve, and I'm not quite sure if well, I think this does relate to what you were saying, but I don't want to create the impression that this is rising to an asymptote. I can't draw curves, I can't draw anything. This is just a curve with an exponential curve, but it's always going to be, it's never going to reach a vertical line. It will just always be I don't know the mathematical way to describe that, but there isn't any straight part of that curve. You could always have a stronger claim if you had a slightly bigger benefit or whatever, or a slightly greater cost. And I think the other thing you're talking about is, I think that's better dealt with through the concept of relevance and through the concept of strength just becoming, infinitely high or something.
Bastian?
Yeah, so it might be a silly question just to help me understand how these intervals work. So imagine that in the interval that you have the loss of a toe there, the kind of lower bound is slightly above the strength of the risk of death. So in that case, it seems that kind of if you think it one way, the kind of toe would fall in the relevance interval of the death, but the risk of death wouldn't fall in the relevance interval of the toe. And then I don't quite know how to understand this situation, so if you could help me out how to understand that.
Thank you for pointing that out. I hadn't noticed that I'd drawn it like that. But this does raise something that I haven't resolved in this model, which is, do we say that two claims are relevant when their relevance ranges overlap? Or do we say that they're relevant when one of their relevance range is overlaps with the strength of the other claim? I kind of lean at the moment towards thinking that any overlap in relevance range is the way to go because it avoids that sort of problem. Because if one relevance range overlaps with another, the other relevance range will always overlap with it, so we don't have this kind of situation. But I can imagine, I haven't quite given up yet. I haven't conclusively decided that saying that you have this situation where the death can relevantly compete with the toe, but the toe can't relevantly compete with the death, that might not be, that's not a bug, that's a feature. But probably the way to resolve this is just to say, look, you have overlap with the relevance ranges, and that's what actually matters. It's not overlap between the range and the strength. But thank you for picking up on that.
I'm afraid I want to allow this to Simon to push on to the final part of this talk.
Okay, so I'll be quick because the final part of the talk is in many ways less worked out than the rest of it. But I thought, right, so I've suggested all these changes to aggregate relevant claims to deal with risk. Aggregate relevant claims was not developed to deal with risk. Aggregate relevant claims was developed to deal with inequality and distributional cases. is anything that I've come up with about risk, and in particular this idea about relevance ranges, and that you should separate out relevance from strength, is any of this relevant, useful for dealing with some cases involving inequality, the cases in which the LC was first developed? And my conclusion is, well, it might be. So, the first issue that I came up with where this seems to be important, and I have briefly discussed with Alex, is this idea that is it possible for two claims that involve equal sized benefits for one of those claims to be irrelevant when compared with the other, simply because the individual with that claim is so much better off? Right? So there's no difference in the size. Now, in fact, when Alex deals with ARC, although he does deal with distributional cases, he's mostly interested in the size of the benefit, the size of the harm being avoided, and so on. But this is no question. So I asked Alex, and he came back and he said, no, he doesn't think that's possible. But the reason he doesn't think that's possible is that he would say that actually inequality doesn't have much of an impact upon strength, and therefore, in his view, upon relevance. Okay, Alex, but sometimes it does, or sometimes it does seem to. So this case here is probably familiar to most of you as like the final step in the mediating paradox. So you start with a very unequal population, a large number, but a small minority of the population all extremely well off, level 100. Everyone else, value-wise living lines, level 1. Should we equalize so that everyone is at level 2? Now, it's still value-wise living lines, but slightly better, and it's better overall. I think we can say on vanilla aggregate relevance claims, and if we didn't pay much attention to the inequality, that this massive loss to the 1 billion would render the small benefits to everyone else irrelevant. We don't need to consider those. This is just the sort of situation that aggregate relevant claims was designed to deal with. And I'm not sure, Alex, maybe that is what you would say. There are people who want to avoid the mere addition paradox by making exactly this move. By saying that, yeah, usually we say that a bigger benefit distributed more equally is better than a smaller benefit distributed less equally. But here's a counterexample. But at least some people say, well, no, because there's inequality in this case, actually this massive loss is worth it, because it achieves an equal distribution and everyone is slightly better off. Now, on the aggregate relevance claims view, of course, if relevance can be so significantly affected by inequality in at least this case, then it would follow that what Alex said was wrong. We'd have to say that strength could also be strongly affected by inequality. And presumably not just in this case, but in other cases as well. So I'm not sure that, as a response, that works. If you want to say that if there are two equally sized benefits, then one cannot be irrelevant to the other simply because it falls to somebody who is better off, you're going to need another way of doing that. Another problem that arises with this is, as I say, if we want to say that the claims of the worst off who will benefit little are relevant when compared to the claims of the better off who will lose a lot, then we have to say that these claims are of somewhat comparative strength. We don't need to say that they're equally strong, but if relevance is going to play a significant role in our theory, we need to say that their strength is comparable. And if their strength were comparable, then we wouldn't need to have 200 billion people being benefited. It would be better just to benefit a smaller number. Here I've chosen 10 billion. Maybe that's not enough. Maybe we need to benefit more. But I think, actually, most people who want to make this move of saying that redistribution in this case is better, want to say these claims are relevant, but they're still much, much weaker. Would probably not even be enough even to benefit 100 billion, and therefore achieve an equal size benefit to loss in this situation. You probably need to benefit more, and so you have a significantly greater benefit to loss. But that implies that the claims are still ever so much weaker. But if they're ever so much weaker on this view, how can they be relevant? Well, you can have that if you separate out relevance and strength in the way that I've suggested. So I think that in cases like this, actually this sort of move works for inequality as well and can produce better outcomes. My final consideration, because possibly you could just avoid this sort of problem merely by saying that relevance isn't that important. You know, even in cases like this, actually these claims were relevant to begin with, and that's why we allow this sort of trade-off. I still come back, you know, my own interpretation is that there is actually an asymmetry. That inequality can make an otherwise irrelevant claim relevant. A small benefit to somebody who's much worse off can be relevant when compared to a larger benefit to somebody who's better off because that person is much worse off. But the opposite isn't true. That inequality doesn't render otherwise relevant claims irrelevant. That if two people have equally strong claims, claims to equal sized benefits, one of them is worse off and will have a stronger claim as a result, they should nevertheless never render the benefit, the equal sized benefit to the better off person irrelevant in comparison. So the example I've used here, and here I've switched to toes and legs, but we might say that saving someone's toe is not normally relevant when compared to saving someone's leg, but that if you're saving the toe of a person whose life is otherwise terrible, that would be relevant. Saving enough of those toes would be worthwhile, even if it meant you had to not save the leg of somebody who's better off. But that if you were saving legs in both cases, there wouldn't be a situation where you say that saving the leg of an otherwise worse off person would render irrelevant any number of legs saved to better off people. And this is a fuzzy intuition, and I'm open to rebuke that this is the wrong way to go, but nevertheless, this is how it feels to me that at least this is an interesting and useful approach to take. So this would work in exactly the opposite way to this situation. You'd start off with, this is saving a person's toe, it's not very relevant. But if that person is much worse off than other people, the relevance rises, and so does the top of the relevance range, but the bottom of the relevance range stays still. If that was what you wanted to do, then eventually you would get to this, which is my fifth pass, and this is what I would like most to defend. So we have modified axiom 3, whereby the strength of a person's claim depends on all three things: the size of the benefit, the well-being level of the person benefited, and their probability of benefiting. The upper bound of the relevance range for their claim, however, depends only upon the size of the benefit and the well-being level of the person being benefited. The lower bound of the person's claim depends only upon the size of the benefit and the probability that they will benefit. Really quick closing comment. If you took this view, which you probably don't, but if you did, then you would find that cases tend to fall on a spectrum with two ends. On one end, you've got neat cases, where there's little inequality and a lot of certainty. These are the sort of cases that we tend to deal with in this kind of seminar. And in these cases, the relevance ranges are narrow. We have aggregation is less permissible, and we have much more, contractualist, deontological type conditions. No, you can't do that. Yes, you can do that. It's pretty black and white. The other set of cases where you have uncertainty and you have inequality and it's messy, the sort of cases I like and I have to deal with, there the relevance ranges are much wider. And you don't have any opportunity for competition between deaf and toes. But here you have lots of opportunity for competition between deaf and toes, if you so wished. And that actually, to my mind, this does seem to point to something significant. That when you have to sit there and make global policy decisions with messy cases involving inequality and uncertainty, I feel it is more appropriate to take that consequentialist framework and allow all this aggregation. But often when you find yourself on the ground and you're dealing with facts as they arise, and you're dealing with people who are in front of you who seem to be more worthy of equal concern, and where there's not such an immediate inequalities and so on and so forth, then actually you do tend to get more drawn towards these sharp black and white value judgments. That to me feels like an everyday intuition. I'm interested and excited about the possibility that maybe this kind of ethical approach would support that view, or at least explain that view. Thanks very much.